Good evening, good evening, good evening. It is a blessing to see you all and to be with you tonight from across this country. We've got representation from various states across the country. My name is Arnold Culbreth. I serve as Director of Ministry Engagement with the Douglas Leadership Institute. And tonight is a joint call between the Douglas Leadership Institute, a 501c3 organization, and the Frederick Douglass Foundation, which is a 501c4 organization, which are both chaired by my dear friend and brother, Reverend Dean Nelson. We are glad that you all are with us tonight. We do take it very seriously, the responsibility, the influence, the impact that God has entrusted to us. And we spend a lot of time praying about who should be featured as a guest speaker on these calls, and tonight is going to be nothing short of encouraging and impactful and informative. So we have the great granddaughter of Booker T. Washington, and Reverend Nelson will give a proper introduction of her relative to her bio. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you for all of the work that you do in your organizations, in your ministries, in your churches across this country, and we appreciate you being with us. I'm going to lead us in an opening word of prayer, and then I'm going to yield the floor to Bishop Dean Nelson. And once I've done that, I'm going to put some information in the chat. If you're not on our regular mailing list, there will be a link in there that you can click on, and you can be added to our mailing list. If you're already on the mailing list, there's no need. But for those of you that may not be regularly receiving our notifications, this will be an opportunity for you to click on it. You don't have to fill it out now. It's not an exhaustive kind of a form. It's very simple. But if you click on it, it will open in a different window that you then can go and complete after this call, if you like. So let me open us in a word of prayer. And let me say this as well before I pray. This call is for the purpose of ministerial engagement and education. It is not intended for the press. Father, we honor you and we love you and we bless your name. We thank you for the opportunity, oh God, and the privilege of being servants of yours, of being heirs of God and joint heirs with Jesus Christ because of the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus Christ. Father, thank you for all of these women and men of God across this nation that are on this call, as well as those that will be with us via rebroadcast, oh God. God, we thank you for the work that they do in their homes and their families and their communities, in their churches and the organizations with which they're a part of and lead. God, we ask that you continue to anoint us afresh, empower us by your Holy Spirit, cause us to exude your word and your love and the influence which you've given us to significantly and positively impact the culture for the advancement of your kingdom and for the glorification of your name. God, we thank you and we ask that you would be with us now as we engage in this very exciting discourse tonight. And we ask all of this in the mighty name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So I now want to present to you your friend and mine, the chairman of the Douglas Leadership Institute and chairman of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, Bishop Dean Nelson.
Amen. Thank you so much, Apostle Culbreth. Great to have everybody on this call. For those of you who have not participated with us in these Leaders Live opportunities, we want to welcome you. We have had a fantastic program over the last year with some great speakers, fantastic leaders, and tonight will be just the same. I have the blessed opportunity to introduce to you all tonight Dr. Sarah Washington O'Neal Rush. Sarah is not only a doctor, she's got her doctorate degree, but she also is a life coach, motivational speaker, and a woman with a fantastic testimony. For our purposes tonight, you should know that she is the great granddaughter of the great American hero, Booker T. Washington. You'll have the opportunity to hear a little bit about Sarah's personal story, her journey, but I hope for many of you tonight, you'll have an opportunity to hear a little bit of what it meant to grow up and be a part of this great family, but also hearing a little bit more about Booker T. Washington. Many of you know we are blessed to have the legacy of the Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass moved off the scene and onto the scene really as one of the great Black American leaders in the beginning, particularly at the beginning of the 1900s, was Booker T. Washington. And so, Sarah, we're grateful to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. So why don't we just start by asking you the question, at what point did you realize that you were part of a special family, the family of Booker T. Washington?
Okay, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So that question, let's see. I always knew from as young as I can remember, I always knew that he was my great grandfather. However, I didn't know what it meant until I was a young adult. And sometimes I think that was by divine design, because it allows me to see how that changes your life when you know where you come from and who you are. But growing up, so my mother is the granddaughter of Booker T. Washington. She was the oldest of 4 daughters born to Ernest Davidson Washington. And she was born and raised across the street from Tuskegee. It was instituted at the time, Tuskegee University. And today she's buried there on the campus along with Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver and her parents and other significant people. But when she was here in California, she didn't talk about it much at all. And I can only now, because I can't really ask her and find out, and she died 5 years after I really learned the significance of it. So I just suspect some of the reasons. And one was my father, who they were divorced. And my father, he would brag about it, but he would never tell us why he was bragging about it. But whenever he'd introduce my brother and I to anyone, he would say, "These are the great grandchildren of Booker T. Washington." But he never said why, And with my mother not talking about it, and we were actually here in Northern California, we grew up maybe about 3 blocks from where the Black Panthers started. And so that was going on. And in those, especially in those days, I should say, there was a mischaracterization of Booker T. Washington. That could have been part of it. And then her and my father didn't get along. And so the fact that he was so happy about it, that could have been a part of it. But she was also, my mom was very modest, and she was a very hard worker. And she believed that people should bring themselves up by their own hard work and on their own merits, and not by who they are, who they know. And so she didn't talk about it, but she didn't understand that me not knowing was a grave disservice to me. So as a child, I was sort of like looking for myself in all the wrong places. But as an adult, as a young adult, when I was 35, and that was in 1996, one of my first cousins wanted to do a family reunion so that his young daughter, would know who Booker T. Washington was. So that was my first time, not only to the university, but also in the South, period. I never really left California. We went to Michigan once for 9 months, but other than that, I was always in Northern California. So when he decided to do this Booker T. Washington first ever family reunion, and we arrived there, my mom was still living. She passed away in 99. There were people there to greet us. There were all kinds of, there were reporters, there were community leaders, there were faculty, students, and they were so excited when we got there, and they wanted to take pictures. Some just wanted to touch us. They wanted autographs. And I'm like, "Mama, what is this? Why are these people so excited that we're here?" And so so for that was like a 4-day reunion. And during that time, one of the most, the thing that I was most, I guess, excited about, or that most inspired me, was that there were original buildings there that Booker T. Washington and former slaves and their descendants, they built these buildings, and they were still in use then. I know they were, at the time, they were demolishing some, so I'm not sure if any are still standing now, but there may be one or two. But they did everything. They did the electricity, they built the furniture, they made the bricks. And so I thought, that just changed my life. I mean, it took 35 years, but I wasn't looking for myself anymore. As I thought, wow, we're powerful, we're incredible. Booker T. Washington was born a slave. These people were born slaves, and yet they were able to do this. And it literally changed my life. And I came home and I read up from slavery for the first time in my life. That further changed my life. And all kinds of, I went back, I finished my master's in psychology because I wanted to help other people. And I knew children needed to know who they were and where they came from at that point.
Wow, this is is fascinating. I mean, just the fact that you kind of knew at one point as a little girl, but it didn't really have an impact on you until later on in your life. And I know that you go around the country and you speak, you're a life coach as well. So for the audience, though, tell us a little bit about just your upbringing, because it wasn't like in a what you might say, you weren't like kind of like in this divine legacy, where you kind of were royalty. You kind of grew up a little bit in more difficult circumstances. So tell us a little bit about that, because it's part of your testimony, which we'll get to.
Yeah, and that's why, especially why I say it was divine design, because in my family, so my mom had 3 sisters. There were 4 of them born to Ernest Davidson, and then there were 2 other grandchildren. And Kenny Morris comes from one of the other grandchildren. He's a great grandson. But out of all of them, they married surgeons. They when they were in Tuskegee, even though my mom was born 4 years after Booker T. Washington died, and she was the oldest of the 4. She was born in 1919, he died in 1915. But even though he wasn't there, they were all treated as like royalty, living right across the street from the school. And so by the time my mom got here and she met my dad, and she met him on a ship she was flown here I think she came on a train to christen a ship being named after Booker T. Washington in Los Angeles. And my dad was chosen as the most eligible bachelor to escort her. So that's how she met him. He was an athlete at UCLA. And, but anyway, they had issues, especially my dad had issues. And he drank and different things that kind of got in the way of, for example, he went to Texas Southern University Law School, but he could never pass the bar. And my mom would always say he could never pass the bar because he could never pass a bar. But he would say it was the discrimination, that he graduated in 1938. And so, they just couldn't get along. And as long as I can remember, they were divorced. And so my mom, she sometimes worked 2 jobs trying to make ends meet. We have 2 older siblings, but they were grown and gone by the time me and my older brother came along. He's 2 years older than I am. And so we were living near poverty. And I just remember that, again, my parents didn't get along, and the way that we grew up, fortunately, I didn't know any of my grandparents because they all died before I was born, with the exception of my grandmother, but she died when I was 9 and I don't remember her. She was in Tuskegee, but I don't remember her. But anyway, we had babysitters up the street, grandma and grandpa, and they were devout. I believe she was a deaconess and he was a deacon. And I think that was my first seed into Christianity. So fortunately for me, I had them. But other than that, there was a lot of chaos. There wasn't a lot of money. And by the age of 16, because my dad ended up leaving, and we used to see him every weekend, but he left and he moved to Los Angeles where where most of his family was. And so by the time I was 16, I became a teenage mom and I ended up on welfare. And the one thing that I can remember my parents ever agreeing on was education, how important education was. And so I went to school. I lived on my own at 17, and I lived in a really bad part of East Oakland. And I went to high school in North Oakland, and I ended up graduating actually 6 months ahead of my class. I would have to get on 2 buses to go to school. I had my son with me. At the time, he was 2, and I would take him to daycare, drop him off, and go to school, and ended up graduating 6 months ahead of my class. But I think that's partially because that's the one thing my parents agreed on, which kind of shows the power of agreement between parents, and they instilled that in me. But the other thing was I had Booker T. Washington's blood running through my veins, and I didn't realize that. The only thing I knew about Booker T. Washington was that he started Tuskegee University. That was in the textbooks. And other than that, I didn't know, but I know, I mean, he did so much more. It would take like a week to go through everything that he's done, all the schools he started. And I don't know if I have time to tell you about one where my husband's from, but I'll wait and let you ask me.
Yeah. Well, no, this is good. I wanted our audience to get a little bit of that background, because sometimes when you have, people that are part of, families that are kind of like, Black royalty or whatever, sometimes we may assume that, that there was a silver spoon type of deal. So, yeah. So, fast forward a little bit, you kind of got the vision after going through the family reunion, a little bit more about your family and its importance and its history. What were some of the things early on after that experience that really impacted you regarding your great-grandfather and his legacy? What I mean, you've mentioned education, which is a hallmark, but tell us some of the things that really struck you about him and the legacy that he left.
I guess, and most of it probably primarily has to do with education, but also just who he was as a person. I learned that at Tuskegee, character was really big, teaching the slaves and their descendants, former slaves, not slaves, but former slaves and their descendants, to respect themselves. When he first arrived there in Tuskegee, he talks about how up from slavery, about how they didn't have much of anything. It was only 16 years after slavery ended. And he went into the rural country districts to discover their needs. And what he saw, he said it surprised even him, and he was a former slave, but the extreme poverty that was there in Tuskegee. And so he knew that he was going to have to train them to change their mindsets about things. And when they first got to the school and they knew they were going to get an education, they thought they weren't going to have to work hard anymore, especially the former slaves that had worked so hard. And he said, no, we're getting ready to build our own buildings. We're going to grow our own food. We're going to, he insisted that there was prayer morning, noon, and night, that they were going to pray. They were just disciplined. He knew he had to put discipline in them and teach them about finances. And a lot of people say that I was on a panel in Buffalo, New York, about 10 years ago now or more. And there were, it was for the 100th anniversary of the Niagara movement, which was a precursor to the NAACP. And I didn't realize, and I was pretty new, it might've been 20 years ago that I think it was that about Buffalo being the Niagara movement and that being Du Bois. And so on this panel, they were all Du Boisians. And so they didn't let me get a word in edgewise. And there were some pretty notable people. Ron Walters, I believe he's passed away, a professor at University of Maryland. And then there was the guy from Lackawanna Blues. And he actually said, I'm sick of hearing about this 10% and this 90%. All Booker T. Washington wanted us to be with slaves. And again, they wouldn't let me get a word. The moderator sat on the panel. I'd never seen anything like it before, but I got in everything on my closing remarks that I wanted to say. And when I walked off of the stage, there was a guy who was at the reception dinner the night before, and the reporters were all over him. I didn't know who he was, but when I walked off, he was right there, and I was feeling all beat up. And he says, "Those people are idiots." And he just kind of made my day. But it was Ishmael Reed, and he's professor from UC Berkeley and from Buffalo, or he lived in Buffalo for a time. But it's just, there's so much misconception about him. And I don't know if I answered the original question that you asked.
No, you did. I mean, what I heard from you was an emphasis on character and what your great grandfather emphasized, particularly to those who came out of slavery, because it's been said, that, as horrible as slavery is, its condition is not ideal to help people understand freedom. And what I mean by that is, if you have been a slave and you've had to basically have most of your life regimented, you've been kind of told it's hard to break out of that mindset. And what you're saying is that your great grandfather tried to create in them a new mindset, a new ethic. And I think that that's extremely important. I believe that, mankind, we're human beings that have a body, but we also, we are a spirit and we have a soul, meaning that those things, your mind, will, and emotions, those things need to be kind of recalibrated. But that's partly what the gospel does, right? I mean, it changes you. So I heard that loud and clear. So I want to go in a moment to kind of the distinction between, Booker T. Washington and others like W.E.B. Du Bois, but talk a little bit about the importance of faith, both as you understand it for your great grandfather, and then also for you, the relationship with Jesus Christ, because I've read not extensively from Booker T. Washington as I have with Frederick Douglass, but there was a very deep spiritual component, but he also was sometimes critical of ministry leaders that were too spiritual and not practical. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, he was almost, it seems, prophetic, because what he talked about then, I see today. And I know I read where he talked about some of them, because they knew that was a way to bring in money too. And they just needed to hoop and holler and excite people. So he talked about that. But he was going to go to theological school before someone approached him to open the school in Tuskegee. Yeah. And he said also that reading the Bible was, was something he did every day. And he did it for the spiritual content as much as the historical value. And then he also said that we left Africa pagans, but we left slavery as Christians. He didn't say it exactly that way, but we left slavery, finding the Romans 8:28, that all things work together, that we left there as Christians. And so I don't think he could have done what he did without his faith. And I didn't grow up in church. I had grandma and grandpa, my babysitters, who I watched, and they lived totally different from the way that we lived, and just nice, neat, disciplined, and good to one another, respectful to one another. But I learned a lot just from that time in Tuskegee. And then between that and then starting to go to church myself, it's just changed my life. Yeah. As an adult. So,
Well, it's a powerful testimony, and we highlight often the impact that Christ had on Frederick Douglass's life
mhm,
as a young boy. There's some
mhm.
fantastic quotes of him in his conversion experience, and so
Okay.
also hearing and reading about Booker T. Washington's devotion to the Lord, and how he wanted to impart that to others.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it was powerful. So
Yeah.
knowing
And
that
he
it's part of your story is important.
Yeah. And he said also that he used to wake up to the fervent prayers of his mother every morning praying for freedom. And that's all they knew, and that's what they had. And so I think, you know, then it meant a lot.
Wow. Well, you started talking a little bit earlier, so let's go to this area about
Um,
misunderstanding about Booker T. Washington. Today, a lot of people, I think, love Frederick Douglass because some that are, I will just say, more progressive, love the quotes from Frederick Douglass, particularly when he was younger, in challenging the hypocritical Christianity of the land. But Frederick Douglass was one who grew and matured, and later in his life, he was a different person, because practically trying to deliver a people, he became a little more practical. And so I bring that up. Booker T. Washington, I think, often is cast in a negative light today. And I think it's often misunderstood. So tell us a little bit about who he was and why you think that there's this misunderstanding about him.
Okay, well, as far as who he was and what he was trying to do, he was actually trying to create business land and property ownership. Like, he didn't want us to continue to be slaves, but he wanted us to take what we learned in slavery and perfect it and excel at it. And in order to build those buildings, they had to know mathematics, they had to know how to read, they had to know everything, architecture, they had to know everything. And so he brought the best and the brightest minds into Tuskegee, including George Washington Carver, who ran the agricultural department. And so I think, I'm not sure, I think people they don't read, they hear things and they run with it. Because I've also heard people that say, yes, I thought one way of Booker T. Washington, but I went to that campus and it changed my whole opinion, just going on the campus of Tuskegee and learning about him and what he did. But there's a book called Christian Business Legends, and they cite that by 1905, I believe it is 1905, that Tuskegee produced more self-made millionaires than Princeton, Harvard, and Yale combined. And one of them was A.G. Gaston, who owned funeral businesses, insurance companies, and that was Booker T. Washington's goal. And so that they mischaracterize him now, I think it just further divides the race. It further hurts us and damages us. And one recent example was the movie The Self-Made by Madam C.J. Walker. They totally mischaracterized him. And I had a cousin that put something on Facebook because she was really upset about it. And people were attacking her. So what Bundles, who I think is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, she said that those things, and she said it in the Facebook post, I believe, but that those things were never said, those misogynistic things that they they portrayed him to say that she never wrote that in her book, and the movie was based on her book. So it's just unfortunate. I'm wondering, like, why did they have to do that? Why did they feel that it was necessary to do that? And when I was looking at the credits, LeBron James signed, he's like a producer. I don't know, maybe they just used his name because I don't think he knows anything about it as well.
Right.
And so it's just those kinds of things. And then they portrayed W.E. Du Bois as being very passive, which I don't think he was that way either. And then a lot of people don't know that they were actually friends before they publicly split. There was never a debate, but they were friends. Du Bois would go with him to collect donations from people like Carnegie and different wealthy white people. But Booker T would always leave him in the lobby because they knew that he wasn't going to hold his tongue if he didn't. That would jeopardize the money. And Booker T. Washington was, the main concern was Tuskegee,
Right.
and training us to improve our lives and to be better.
Wow, that is that's powerful imagery and real. I did see that movie,
Yes,
Madam C.J. Walker, and I think that it was a mischaracterization for certain. I know that your cousin Kenny definitely did not like the portrayal of Booker T. Washington in that film as well.
Yeah, and the one thing that, so he did initially, he said no, because another thing people do is they take things out of context. And so in those days, women didn't speak at these conferences. So at first he did resist, but she insisted. And then when she did, he invited her back. And then she donated to some of his causes. They became business associates. They left all of that out of the movie. But why not say that to kind of bring us together? I don't know.
No, I totally agree. Something that I wanted to bring up, because you just mentioned it about going and getting the money. I'm reading from an excerpt. It says, it's speaking about an event in Madison Square Garden in New York, where there was an event that was presided over by President Grover Cleveland, and said that your great-grandfather spoke, and that evening Andrew Carnegie pledged $600,000, of which $150,000 was specifically for the personal use of Booker T. Washington and his family. It says that he was stunned and embarrassed by the gesture and was well aware of how the acceptance of such a sum of personal money might appear to others, and felt compelled to refuse it. After negotiating, a compromise was worked out in which that amount would be given to Tuskegee, from which Washington would be paid his normal salary. So anyway, that speaks to how serious he was, having the admiration and support of people like Andrew Carnegie and others during that time period.
Right. You're right. And he also, the Sears Roebuck, the Walden.
Julius Rosenwald.
Yes.
Yep.
And they built the schools modeled after Tuskegee. Yep. And I think by the time Rosenwald died, there were like 5,000 schools or something. And that's where I was saying with my husband, he's from Laurinburg, North Carolina. And there's nothing there. There's no sidewalks. There's not much there, but there's a school there. It's Laurinburg Institute, which is one of the 4 maybe remaining Black boarding schools in our college prep schools in the country. Right. So he showed me that school, and then in, I can't remember which year, they had their 100th anniversary. And that's when my mother-in-law, who they all went to that school, she asked them if they wanted the great-granddaughter to speak. And they said, well, do you know her? And she said, well, yeah, she's married to Tony. So anyway, we found out then that the children in that, or the parents of children in that city, asked if Booker T. Washington, they wrote a letter to him asking if he would help them start a school, a decent school, so their children could learn. So he and Spike Lee's grandfather, who was the president of Snow Hill, Alabama, a school in Snow Hill, Alabama, they went there together. And he sent two students, I believe they were from Tuskegee, two of Tuskegee's graduates back, and they were the McDuffies, and they opened the school. And so, and they did it, you know, it was modeled after Tuskegee. They built the building and all of that, the bricks and everything. And so it's still there today.
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you this question, and then we're going to, in a few minutes, take some questions from our audience. But it's been said that part of the reason that there was a backlash against Booker T. Washington came with some Black Americans came after his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, which is what it's sometimes referred to. And there were people in the North, particularly like Monroe Trotter of The Guardian, that began to attack Booker T. Washington. Can you help us to know a little bit about that speech? If you know why it was important. I mean, obviously Booker T. Washington led the National, Negro Business League. His whole emphasis, as you said, was trying to create wealth within our community. But that speech seemed to, as famous as it was, seemed to get some negative backlash from some people in the North.
And I think the biggest part of that was when he said that we can be as separate as the fingers when it comes to the social being together, but in economics, he wanted to be together. So we can be as separate. So they looked at that. I guess the Trotters and others thought that we need to be together socially. We need to be together in every way. But he was just like, we don't have to be among you. We don't have to be with you. Just help us out economically so we can grow that way and we can contribute to the country. And so even they say that W.E.B. Du Bois, then he congratulated Booker T. Washington until his followers like Trotter were against him. So then he turned against it. But after that speech, because that was a speech that they say put Washington on the map as well, even further than Tuskegee did. And I think it was just like a 5-minute speech. It was packed. And he prayed as he did with everything before he gave it. But I believe it was, that social issues that they wanted more than that, than just the economic.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I mean, he grew up, a slave in Virginia, right, where I'm from.
Okay.
And you mentioned again, just the fervent prayers of his mother impacted his life. But his life has impacted you in a way that you and your cousin, Gloria, whom I met, you guys wrote a book together. So tell us a little bit about that book, if people can get it, because I was really inspired to hear about how you guys were inspired really by your great-grandfather to write that book together.
Okay, yeah, we were trying to figure out, we decided we wanted to do a book together, and we were trying to figure out what we have most in common, and that was our Christianity. And so the name of the book is Timeless Treasures, Reflections of God's Word in the Wisdom of Booker T. Washington. And so we took our favorite quotes, we combined them over, I believe it's over 100 quotes, and we matched each one with a different scripture. We talked on the phone for hours at a time for at least a year, if not more, and we matched the scripture with the quote, and we wrote an introduction. She did one. Well, there's about 10 chapters, and each of us took 5 and wrote the introduction and what that chapter meant to us. And the chapters are based on things that he was big in, like character, responsibility, race relations, spirituality, and different, I'm trying to think,
Well, can you relate any of the quotes that may have been important for you from Booker T. Washington? I know we've talked a little about some themes, but are there any quotes or Bible passages that maybe you recall that were important?
So I have a lot of favorite quotes from him. One of them is that it's important and right that all privileges of law be ours, but it's vastly more important that we be prepared for those rights and privileges. So in other words, what's the use in having them if we don't know how to properly exercise them?
Mhm.
Another is it's more, it's not as high, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's far more important where a person is not where they've gone in life, but where they've come from to get
Right.
where they end up. So I messed that one up. But another one that is about, I'll never allow any man to drag me down so low as to make me hate him. He didn't even hate his slave master. So that right there tells you he's Christian, he's following his Christian belief. He didn't even hate slave masters. And there's so many. There's one about don't tell me how to build a building, but give me the equipment so that I can build the building. That's worth far more than telling me how to build it. And another one about not having much respect for people to tell him what he can't do.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me what I can do.
Yeah.
And so there's so many.
That's great. No, this is a good field. Is there a place where they can get that book? I think you mentioned that it might still be on Amazon. I think I did see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
What's the
is.
title?
Yeah. It's Timeless Treasures, Reflections of God's Word in the Wisdom of Booker T. Washington.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll see if we can we find that and put that link in the chat so that people can get that. So we have a few questions that are actually coming in. So one of those questions is, can you recommend a reliable biography on Booker T. Washington?
So one that I don't know if it's in this room here. It's probably in another room. I haven't. Well, here's one. I'll get this one. But there are others. Lewis Harlan wrote 2 volumes. They were Pulitzer Prize winning books, and it's called Booker T. Washington. He was born in 1856 to something like 1901, and then the second one is Booker T. Washington 1901 to 1915 when he died, and that's Lewis Harlan. And so, yeah, that's a good one because he critiques him as well. So it's not just being nice about everything that he did. And the other one, this one is up from History, The Life of Booker T. Washington, and it's by Robert J. Norrell, Norrell. Mm-hmm.
That is great. That is great. Thank you for that.
Okay, and there was one more. It's called The New Negro, Uncle Tom or The New Negro. Can't remember quite who that's by, and I might be fudging on that name. But that one was just stories of different people telling their experience. Maybe they had parents that went to Tuskegee. And one lady, that's where I found out that those bricks that he made, that there's bricks all over the South, that because people will come and purchase bricks from Tuskegee, and he would take that money and put it back into the school because the bricks were of such superior quality.
Wow. We have another question from Pastor Keith McCullough. If you know about this, he says, what light can you shed on the meal with Roosevelt? Roosevelt claims this never happened. So I'm unfamiliar with that. So I don't know if you know anything about a meal that your great-grandfather may have had with Roosevelt, and then maybe Roosevelt said never happened.
Sure. Okay, I didn't know about the part where Roosevelt said it never happened. I didn't think that he denied it, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But so he invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House. And he was actually, I have this, because I wanted to remember, let me see, Roosevelt. No, it wasn't Roosevelt. I was going to say, I spoke at the the Founders Day in 2019, and there were some presidents. There was Taft and Hoover and H.W. Bush, who were also previous speakers. But I thought Roosevelt was one, but he wasn't. Maybe at a graduation. But so that caused division among the Blacks. The Blacks were mad at Booker T. Washington for going. The whites were mad at Roosevelt for inviting him. But he was the first Black to dine at the White House. As far as I know, that happened. Yeah.
Got it. Well, maybe there was reports, if whites were not happy, that maybe there were some reports that that he didn't take it. I'm not sure. There's another person that is saying that they thought that Tori Snow, who's our president of our group in Maryland, said that he thought that Roosevelt actually was proud of the meeting. So we'll have to do a little bit of research on that.
I think so. I will too. I have a book. I tell you, I have books everywhere, but I have a book here about that I don't even think I ever opened. So I'm going to open it now.
Got it. So there's another question that's come in about the perception of Blacks involved in the process of his time. What was Booker T. Washington's perception of Blacks involved in the political process? So, there's sometimes, some debate, I suppose, about advancement for Blacks through the political process versus advancements through Blacks through business and ownership. So can you speak to that, his perspective of Blacks involved in the political process?
Well, all I know that he had the ear of Taft, McKinley, and Roosevelt. He would, and he also had a newspaper that had a lot of influence, and he had a lot of influence. And so he was responsible for different people getting into political life. And as far as the reason that he opened Tuskegee actually is that Lewis Adams, who was I believe he was a tinsmith in Tuskegee, and he had a lot of influence before Booker T got there, Black guy. And they wanted a political favor because someone was running for office. And he told them that if they opened a school in Tuskegee, that they would, that he would make sure that the Blacks voted, because they were voting, so that he'd make sure that they would have that vote there. And so that's when they sent Booker T to open Tuskegee. And I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
Yeah. No, I think so. I'll chime in on this because I know that in that speech that we referenced that he gave in Atlanta, there were a few statements that he made essentially saying, hey, we have had a lot of this, opportunity for advancement in the political process. We've had this number of, elected officials, but we still haven't gotten kind of like our full share. So I think from my reading, he believed, he didn't discount the political, the political involvement and process, but felt that if we put all of our eggs in that basket, we would never achieve what we could if we owned our own, if we focused on prosperity and business and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and he gave money to different causes for that under the table, though. He did it under the table for different political people, but he didn't do it outright because he knew he was getting cooperation from these wealthy people to build Tuskegee. And he wasn't willing to compromise that, but he gave money under the table.
Someone mentioned that you mentioned about the newspaper. What was the name of the newspaper that you referenced earlier?
I'm not the one where that he had. I'm not
Yes,
sure.
ma'am.
Yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
I can find out and I can get back to you on that.
Okay. That's great. Because I wasn't aware that it doesn't, it doesn't surprise me, but I wasn't aware that it had a paper. So we have time for a couple of other questions. One from Tori Snow is, are there people or institutions that still carry on the vision of Washington besides Tuskegee? Are there institutions or people that you know? And I think I might know one of those that Gloria mentioned, but that carry on that legacy today.
Mhm. Well, I would say Laurinburg Institute. Is that what you're talking about? Which is a
Yep.
school. A lot of schools. There are so many schools that are named after Booker T. Washington, but that doesn't necessarily mean
Right.
that
Right.
they're following what he taught. There is in San Francisco, there is the Booker T. Washington Community Center. But again, to be honest, I don't know that they're following what his principles would have been.
Right. There are two things that come to my mind. Maybe you can affirm this. One, I think Gloria mentioned a mutual friend of ours, Eddie Huff, who is, doesn't he run like a Booker T. Washington Institute or something like that? It's at a Christian
Society.
school.
I believe Booker T. Washington Society, which
Okay.
was started by someone who passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Booker T. Washington Society, and I believe that's out of Washington, D.C.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I think probably when we get off the Zoom, more are going to come to mind. So I will also, I'll also follow up on that too.
The second one that I'm aware of is in, I want to say in Mississippi, there's a school called Piney Woods
Oh,
that
yeah.
is based
Yeah.
on the very principle, because the students, it's like a preparatory school where
It
they
is.
actually have to work that like pays for part of their education. So
Yeah.
Piney Woods is a
Right.
school that Bob Woodson has
Okay.
highlighted over the last year or two.
Yeah, that's one of the 4 schools. Laurinburg Institute is one, and then Piney Woods, and I think there may be 2 more in the country. But I used to work as a counselor with at-risk youth, and I would recommend Piney Woods to some of the children, the families. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Let's see, there's a couple of others. What advice can you give to inspire more economic freedom for Blacks? That's from former state representative Melvin Everson, who's also a minister of the gospel. Thanks, Melvin, for that question.
Okay, so ask me that again. What is
Yeah, advice that you would give or can give to inspire more economic freedom for Blacks?
economic freedom?
Yeah, any advice that you would give to inspire that? I mean, obviously the testimony that you're sharing from your great grandfather, but anything else that you feel like could help inspire that?
So I guess I haven't given that a lot of thought, but I think just off the cuff, if I was thinking about, is to first recognize that there is some economic freedom that we're not recognizing, to recognize more of the opportunity that's there to be taken advantage of, or yeah, I think we have some things that we just don't recognize it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, the examples of some of the schools, and I hope that these discussions can help inspire people to look at all of the success. I mean, the quote, the stat that you mentioned earlier about, and I don't, maybe you could recall the book again, where it emphasized how many millionaires were produced from Tuskegee versus Princeton, Yale, and some of those other Ivy League schools.
Christian business legends. And they have like Mother Teresa's in there, Booker T. Washington. There's about nine people, 9 leaders. But, you know, a lot of it too, I just think that I'm just really big on personal responsibility and not waiting for someone else to get, or people and systems we don't trust or we say we don't believe in. I just feel like when I look at what he was able to do as a former slave, I just think we don't recognize how powerful we are. We're very divided as a people. And I just think some of the things that happened to us I often say, and I know this isn't popular, but Black lives won't matter to anybody else until they matter to us. My granddaughter's father was murdered by another Black person. So that just, those kind of things that I just think we're not getting a good grasp on how we can help each other succeed. I think we're powerful beyond measure, resilient, but sometimes we refuse to recognize that.
Well, that is consistent with this last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Apostle Culbreth. But Keisha asked, as great granddaughter of the legend and seeing the challenges we face today with some in the Black community, race hustlers dismissing the historical success to only push victimhood, what advice do you have to share for those who are discouraged about what's going on?
So I'm discouraged, but I'm discouraged because we're so discouraged, and that just drives me crazy. And so, gosh, I just wish that we would open our minds a little bit more, at least where it's, where we see it, where it's broadcast on the TV, on so big. And I just have so many friends that just, we think so differently about the problem, and we bump heads a lot, and a lot of closed minds. And I guess if we could listen to each other, I mean, I was in one place at one time, but I've evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sometimes think, again, it's not popular, but that we have it wrong.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you a lot of people on this event that are listening to you tonight would agree with you and believe that we have a great legacy, but some of us have misunderstood, and sometimes we don't draw from the rich legacy of people like your great grandfather. And so anything that we can do to help celebrate it, we're grateful that you have joined us tonight. We are at the end of our time. So thank you so very much. This was recorded. So once we can give you a copy of this link, and this will be rebroadcast again to some of our through some of our social media platforms. So I'm going to turn it back over to Apostle Culbreth for closing remarks and prayer. So Arnold, the floor is yours. Thanks again so very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Doctor, thank you for being with us tonight. These kinds of calls are very necessary, not just for those of us that are represented in the age groups on this call right now, but for those younger than us as well. It's like the old adage, if we don't know our history, then oftentimes we're doomed to repeat it. So this is very informative and enlightening and encouraging. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Man. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for these kinds of gatherings, Father, where we can have dialogue and we can be informed about the rich history that you've allowed us to have, not only as a people, but also as a nation. Father, God, we pray that you would cause there to be a revival, as it were, relative to the thirst and the quest for information, and accurate information at that, even as was posed in the chat, Father, solid, credible historical accounts of Booker T. Washington and others that have gone on before us. Father, as we asked at the top of the hour, we ask now that you would continue to bless the women and the men on this call, Father God, and all that they do for your glory and for the advancement of your kingdom. Father, we thank you, we praise you, and it's in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you all to join us next month, where we will have an equally robust time of discussion And again, if you're not on our regular mailing list, please join us. Please visit our websites at dlinstitute.org and also fdfnational.org. Again, that's dlinstitute.org and fdfnational.org, and you can find out more about what we're doing. You can also follow us on Facebook at both Frederick Douglass Foundation and also the Douglass Leadership Institute. So God bless you all. Have an incredible evening and keep shifting the culture for good together.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a good evening.
Have a good evening.